Hello, welcome to the Inside the Birds NFL Draft Preview Show. Tonight is the start of the 2024 NFL Draft. First round beginning at 8 p.m. The Eagles are selected or slated to pick 22nd overall. Rounds 2 and 3, of course, are Friday and Saturday. We've got all the intel, all the breakdown you'll need to be ready in a two-part show. I'm Geoff Mosher alongside my co-host Adam Caplan. And joining us for part one, the man who watches more college prospect tape than anyone else, Greg Cosell from NFL Films and ESPN's NFL Matchup Show. Are you ready? You're at the finish line here, Greg? I know you got the bags under your eyes. Are you ready?
Yeah, I never feel good about it, Geoff, because there's always guys I miss, and I've probably seen, I don't know, 140 guys in the detail that I want to see. So, but of course, there'll be somebody drafted in the second round, and I'll go, oh, man, I didn't see that guy. It always works that way. What are you going to do?
That's right. We got your back because with you and our part two guest, who is Senior Bowl Executive Director Jim Nagy, we probably won't miss too many prospects. I think
he'll know the guys.
Yes, both of you guys watch more college prospect tape than probably anybody on the planet Earth. So we've got that coming in this show. And just for our special Patreon members, there's going to be an extra interview with Greg posted on our Patreon channel. You're really going to want to see that. That's at patreon.com/insidethebirds. So fellas, this is the moment we've been waiting for. Let's begin. Obviously, for this draft, based on a lot of our intel, it appears there are two major positions to watch for with the Eagles in round one, no matter where they end up picking. And as we know, they don't often pick where they're slated to pick. Offensive line and cornerback. Adam, let's just discuss the overall strategy we've heard here leading up to tonight's first round.
Yeah, I'd agree with that totally. It could be, as we've talked about for a couple of months, a tackle could play right guard. I know you've had in your information that the Eagles aren't necessarily looking at it that way. Of course, if they had the druthers would be great because we know Jeff Statler loves the guys who could play more than one position, like Tyler Steen, by the way, who wound up not only just playing tackle in college, but here with the Eagles, he had to be cross-trained, and right now he'd be their starting guard, but they're looking for competition there as they get through the draft, could be in the first round. And a cornerback, yeah, that's the trade-up position. But I would say this, as someone who used to work for the Eagles told me this morning. He goes, look, he goes, I know Howie pretty well. If a stud offensive lineman drops to them, he's not just going to take a lower-graded corner because he needs one. Offensive line means more to them, as we know, as an organization, going back decades. So don't discount that one if a guy gets close enough, as you and I talked about, Jeff, earlier on our final note show that dropped.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, we always go to you for tape breakdowns, but you speak to so many GMs and coaches, and you've been in the business long enough. I wanted sort of you to expand on this because Adam and I say it a lot. A lot of people have given us feedback, fans that is, saying another offensive line. You got two tackles. You're going to maybe draft a kid if he can't play guard who's not going to play. It's a waste of a pick. We always say the draft is about the future. You can never know who's going to stay healthy, and the best teams do this. Is that something you hear constantly when you talk with NFL personnel and coaches, that you draft for the future and you don't really take into account things that other people might be concerned about?
Well, and I think that's where GMs and coaches often have disagreements. And when I say disagreements, I don't mean they get into big battles and yell and scream, but
sometimes
they do. Yeah, sometimes they do. But the point is that teams are always looking ahead. GMs, that's their job to look ahead. None of us know how long Lane Johnson's going to play. Right now, the right guard position is totally up in the air. It's easy to sit here today on April 25th and say, well, offensive line looks okay. But maybe next year it doesn't look okay. Maybe Lane Johnson, if he gets injured again this year, decides to pack it in. And then all of a sudden, people are saying, well, what happened to their offensive line? It was the strength of the team. And now we've got issues. And the assumption is that Cam Jurgens will be a great center. We don't know that. So, there are questions that do exist, and teams do look ahead. And I think there's no question that this team under this organization, which is not likely to change at any time soon, really believes that the offensive line is a true foundation piece and that you can't play winning football without a really strong O-line. So people can disagree with that, but that's the way they think. And therefore, if they stay at 16, is that
22.
22. Excuse me. I don't know why 16 was in my head. 22. If they stay there, we'll see. If not, look, if there's an offensive lineman that they really, really like and they just have to move up to 17 or 18, they could easily do that. We've seen them do those kinds of things before. I don't think they would move up to 10. They'd have to give up too much.
Right.
But, you know, I think if they could reasonably move up, they would do so if there was someone there they really liked.
Well,
corner is a true position, in my view. I don't think, again, there's a lot of statements made in March and April that really don't mean anything. I mean, they've made a lot of statements about James Bradbury, and that's fine right now. And he's a great guy. And you know, everybody likes James Bradbury. Boy, would I be really surprised if they truly believe he can line up and play corner this year as your starting outside corner. But maybe that's what they feel. But corner to me is a true position of need right now.
Well, you're a true pro because you've segued into our first topic for the night. We're going to look ahead, as you just said, to what the Eagles might do in a few hours. And cornerback is a position that they've put a ton of work into, invited all the top cornerback prospects to the NovaCare this offseason in the pre-draft cycle. And B, as you mentioned, Howie Roseman is known to move up. He has actually made trades in each of the last first 3 rounds. And that doesn't even include trading a first-round pick on draft night for A.J. Brown a couple of years ago.
Right.
2 corners, Greg, that the Eagles would probably have to move up to get. Again, you never know, but based on our intel and our information, would be Toledo's Quinyon Mitchell and Alabama's Terrion Arnold. So give us a quick breakdown. We know you've discussed them both on your show on our platform, the Intel with Greg Cosell, but compare and contrast if you could for us.
Well, I think they're different players. You know, Arnold, again, I don't get into lists. You know, he'd be considered one of the better corner prospects in this draft. He's got really good traits. He's a very comfortable player. He played a lot of press man at Alabama. They play a lot of press. He's a mirror match master. And by that, I mean, he lines up in press coverage and he doesn't necessarily put his hands on the receiver. He matches him. He mirrors him. So we call it mirror match. He's got pretty sudden feet and movement. He's very smooth and fluid. One issue that he has to deal with is at times he would lose contact with the receiver at the top of the route stem. That's something that he needs to work on. I didn't think he was as comfortable in off coverage as he was in press coverage. But, you know, again, that could be technique stuff, which I'm not a DB coach. But I love the way in which he played. He was a very aggressive player. And I would think that would be something that they would really like about the kid. Really aggressive, played the run really well, just embraced the physical nature of the game. I mean, that he was that kind of kid. So, you know, he's a good prospect. But people need to understand in this draft, there's no Patrick Surtain. This is not an unbelievable corner draft. There's some good prospects, as there always are, but there's not one guy that you go, hey, that's the guy. Although the only guy, in my view, that might be thought of that way is the second guy you mentioned, Quinyon Mitchell, just because he's much more of a traits-heavy player. He's bigger. He almost looks like a running back. His athletic testing measurables were really, really good. So he's got size, he's got speed, he's got physicality, he's super competitive. He was phenomenal at the catch point. The only thing is you're going to have to teach him a little bit how to play press because he hardly ever played press at Toledo. He almost always played off coverage. But when it came to plan and drive, click and close, whatever term you want to use, when you play off and you have to react to routes in front of you, he was explosive downhill, really explosive with his plan and drive from off coverage, and that's what he predominantly played. So Mitchell, to me, just if you're looking at a toolsy player, a traitsy player, it would probably be Mitchell, but Arnold's probably a more sort of complete, safer player. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, Adam.
Greg, one thing.
Go ahead.
I just want to add one thing with Greg. Does Arnold's 4.45 40 worry you at all? Does he play faster? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I wouldn't say it worries me. It could worry some.
Okay.
Yeah, he didn't get beat over the top very much, but again, that's not the NFL. It could worry some, but I think he played faster than that.
Gotcha.
Adam, to double confirm Greg's observations, we both have been told that this cornerback class, the top 2 guys that we've been talking about, really aren't yet in that Patrick Surtain or Sauce Gardner category coming out. I did speak to a scouting source in the AFC who felt that they have the traits and capabilities to eventually get to a level where they could be a couple of multi-time Pro Bowlers, but they do have some work to do in that regard. But they did, as it was turned to me, they like the toolbox that's there to work with those two guys.
Right, and what I
See
think
that?
you're alluding to, Sauce Gardner, J.C. Horn, and Surtain, as Greg mentioned, no, these guys, and even Mitchell, as talented as he is, the term is that you use the color grading system of blue, red, purple, and all that. Gardner, Horn, and Surtain we're seeing coming into that draft, and there's some truth to that going forward, that they're high blue players, high blue chip prospects, where Mitchell's a step below that. But as Greg's talking about, it doesn't mean he can't be a really good football player. It's just
No.
he doesn't possess maybe their talent. Even Horn, now we see Horn now, he's been hurt a lot, but he was a major traits player, very physical, or maybe too physical because of the penalties in college. But those three guys were seen as better talents than Mitchell.
Awesome. All right. There were other first-round projected corners who visited the Eagles at the Nova Gear complex. Kool-Aid McKinstry, also from Alabama. He was a teammate of Terry and Arnold's. There's Nate Wiggins from Clemson. And the true sort of wild card among the bunch is Cooper DeJean from Iowa. Greg, we like to call them the eyes of the beholder type of players, as you know, they could go in any range there, and maybe even second round, just based on how teams see them. Of those three, I'm not going to have you compare and contrast. They're all different, but obviously Wiggins would be the one who has the traits, right? And DeJean would be that one who is probably the most versatile, you would say?
Yeah, I mean, Wiggins, the only issue with Wiggins really is he weighs 173. So you have to decide what that means. And again, it might mean nothing. We had the same conversation with the wide receiver, Devonta Smith, when he came out and weighed 160. And there's no question that was a conversation that was had in every draft room. And he's turned out to be a really good player. So that's the only concern with Wiggins. He's probably the most athletically gifted corner in terms of size, length, speed. I mean, he's over 6'1". He ran a 4.28. His measurables were really, really good. He did play physical press man, targeted physicality, not every snap. He played mirror match. He's a guy that knows he's fast because there were a lot of snaps. And again, it'll be interesting to see when he gets to the league. There were a lot of snaps where my sense was he kind of let himself get beat off the line of scrimmage, but he has such accelerating speed that he just was able to recover in 3 steps, because he's a 4.28 guy. So I would say he's another guy that when he played off, he had that explosive plan and drive closing speed. Like I said, you could make the argument that this guy is as physically talented as any corner in the draft. You just have to decide, about the weight. I mean, how does that impact how you use him? Does he have to be an outside corner essentially? Or would he only play in sub? And when I mean sub, not play nickel in the slot, but only play when you go to your nickel or your dime.
Right.
So, but he's really gifted. Now, Cooper DeJean is going to be a major conversation in draft rooms, and I imagine that's been the case with the Eagles as well, because Cooper DeJean, to me, I personally think his best position is safety, but I know there are people who think he can play corner. He's an explosive straight line athlete. That's what he is. He's an explosive straight line athlete. He's a little stiff, and that shows up both in press man and in off coverage. Now, does that mean he can't play corner in the NFL? I would never say that. But if you just sort of as an absolute, as you're evaluating the player, and I think he's a really good player. I think he sees things really well. I think he has a feel for the game. He makes quote unquote plays, but to me, he's a safety.
Okay, Adam, getting back to Wiggins, you had some intel, I believe, on the weight that Greg was talking about. Did he add or stronger? What did we know about that?
He did. At his pro day at Clemson, he did weigh in at 182, and he plays in the 180s. But
there you go.
Yeah. Now here's the thing, though, Greg. Let's go to his tape. Does he look like he's in the 180s when you see him in a uniform? I know it's hard to say that, but
he looks thin, but I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you that he's 181 or 174. I don't know.
No. Does he look thin? Is my question though. Does he look?
Yeah, I mean, he's that's the way he's built. He's over 6'1".
Right.
He's never going to look girthy or anything, but. Right. I mean, there's a big difference. That's a 10-pound difference. If he's in the 180s, that's not an issue at all. Keep in mind, that Denzel Ward was the 4th pick in the draft at 182 pounds. And we can, he's been a good player. Maybe he's not been unbelievably great, but he's certainly been a good corner in the league. Nate Wiggins, if he's over 6'1" and weighs between 180 and 185, you couldn't make the argument he's the best corner prospect in the draft.
Interesting. Greg, it's interesting from an Eagles standpoint. As for Wiggins, because we've heard from several teams that there were some maturity concerns. Some have won, and I know that you don't always get this info. There were some who wondered about his passion for football. So there are some questions there. But from an Eagles standpoint, we know that they like athletic testing, and we know they place analytics as a big part of what they do. They have taken some character risks lately. They did it last year with Jalen Carter, and this is, Wiggins isn't even close to that kind of
right.
a character risk. And it just, you sort of think about with all these corners here. We all know about the time that the Eagles picked JJ Arcega-Whiteside over Paris Campbell because they went with sort of upper management and that lean toward the analytics. So that's just something to keep in mind. And
then I think what teams do think about, guys, is they think about the position room. So you have someone like Bradbury, who's a great guy and very mature. Someone like Slay, who's been in the league a long time. Okay, he knows it's not his first rodeo. So you come into that corner room and you probably have guys who are going to help you become a pro. That's what you would assume. But Wiggins is really talented, really talented.
Would you say, getting back to DeJean as we kind of close it out on corners, sometimes you call a guy a fun watch, sometimes you call a guy a tough watch because of the projection? When you were watching DeJean, was your kind of mind racing? Like, I could see him doing this on this team, that on that team. Because Adam and I have said he's a guy that if you're going to draft high, especially in the first or early second round, you have to have a plan for him.
Well, the point is you got to know what he is in your system. If you're going to draft him in the first round, you're not drafting him in the first round with the idea that, well, when we get to OTAs and minicamp, we'll see what he is. You're drafting him in the first round. That you might do that with a guy in the 4th or 5th round, but if you're drafting a guy in the first round, then you're drafting him with the idea that, hey, he's going to start at corner. He's going to start at safety. It's not, well, we'll see.
Right.
Well, in my opinion, you shouldn't be approaching it that way, but so you have to know what he is in your mind. Now, do I think he can play corner? I don't want to say no, he can't, because he's a really good athlete and he's a super smart kid. He's one of those guys. I mean, he came just, so people understand this kid, he came from such an incredibly small town in Iowa. I mean, he played quarterback and defensive back. He was a state champion in the 100-meter and 4x100 relay. He only had football offers from Illinois State and South Dakota State and North Dakota State, and Iowa came in really late. So, he wasn't a big-time recruit, but this kid's a really, really good athlete, straight line. He's very linear, but he makes plays, and he's a smart player. But you gotta know, if you're going to draft him, if the Eagles, let's say they end up at 22, okay, just the way the draft works, and Cooper DeJean is sitting there, if they're going to draft him, they got to draft him knowing that, well, he's going to go right a corner or he's going to play safety. You got to know.
Yep, absolutely. Fastest straight line guy out of Iowa since Tim Dwight, we'll say. Remember him?
Tim Dwight.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right.
We were returner. Yeah.
Yes.
Dwight.
Yes. We're going to have more on day 2, day 3 guys with Greg in part 2 for our Patreon members. Adam, just before we move on to offensive line, obviously with the potential of a trade up here, if the Eagles want to move up for a corner or any other position, we discussed they would have to probably package one of their 2 second-round picks to move significantly up in the draft, and they don't have a 3rd-round pick. If they do this for a corner, say Quinyon Mitchell or Terrion Arnold, is that sort of questionable strategy for a prospect who doesn't per se tantalize scouts the way a Patrick Surtain did?
Well, look, you can't. Here's the thing, though, on that point, it's fair, but those guys are rare. Like, those are high blue players are just, you don't see them a lot. They only come around once in a while. Sometimes, I don't want to say they would be selling for Mitchell or Arnold if they wind up getting them, but you know what? Greg just talked about it. It's a super important position. So it's a top 3 or top 4 position for a club of all NFL teams when they look at value. And you can't really compete unless you're good there. You can't hide a corner. I mean, it's really hard to do that.
Yep.
So Howie's kind of in a situation where they have the oldest cornerback tandem in the NFL. Believe this or not, Slade turns 34 in January.
Yeah.
Okay, the oldest projected starting corner in the NFL. So they have to start looking at him too. And the two kids they have behind him they like, but they're not seen as potential starters. Ricks has been a nice story, but he's not a guy that they're looking at starting down the line, not at this point.
Right.
So they kind of have to do it. Now, here's another thing. One other thing I'll add to this before we move on offensive line. The word around the league is that if you don't get these top guys, and we're including Wiggins in it too, the drop off is pretty significant to the next group based on the teams I've spoken with about the cornerback position.
Mm-hmm.
Like Melton's just on the edge of it, but he's not quite there. Rakestraw and others. So that's why, to me, if you don't get one of those guys there, you actually might want to look to trade down.
Well, I would just add before we move ahead that then it all depends on how you evaluate the players. There's two corners I really like that because I was thinking as you were talking that if they don't get one of those guys and they wanted to trade, I mean, there's two corners I really like that are not going to go in the first round. And I would think they'll go on day 2 for sure. But again, then it just comes down to evaluation and everybody's different. I really like Renardo Green from Florida State and I really like TJ Tampa from Iowa State. So that's me. That doesn't, I'm one of those guys when a team drafts, I don't say things like, well, they reached, because I don't know what their board looks like.
Right.
Reasonable people are doing the evaluating for all these teams. They're not idiots. But we can disagree on our evaluation of players. It's very possible that the Eagles don't like Renardo Green, and I wouldn't say, well, they're stupid. I really liked him on tape. I like TJ Tampa. They may not, but to me, if you don't get what you want early, I would have no problem trading out and taking one of those guys. That would work for me because I like their tape.
Absolutely. All right. Well, there's one thing that nobody disagrees on, Greg and Adam, and that's that there are a lot of really good offensive linemen in this draft, and we might see 7, maybe 8 offensive linemen go in the first round tonight alone. If the Eagles stick at 22, depending on how the board falls, you might see prospects like Tyler Guyton of Oklahoma, Amarius Mims of Georgia, maybe even Washington's Troy Fautanu could be there, depending on how the board falls. So, Adam, I'll talk to you on this. The Eagles did a lot of work on offensive linemen this pre-draft cycle. Guyton and Fautanu both went to the NovaCare for a visit. There were some other guys who might be late 1, early 2, mid 2 guys who went there. They don't have an opening, as we discussed, at right tackle, and they may not have one for a year or two. What do you think the strategy would be here if they drafted a tackle?
Well, okay, so Fautanu projects to play, although as we were talking a couple weeks ago, that some teams have told us don't discount him at left tackle. Like people are just because he's only 6'4", maybe under 6'4", but he's got longer arms.
Yep.
But in general, what's that?
I even heard that today from a scouting.
Okay.
This guy can play left tackle.
See, there you go.
34.5-inch arms.
Right.
Yeah.
Why couldn't he? Greg, it's funny you say that because the guy I spoke to goes, what makes him not a left tackle? I'm like,
the only thing that would make people think that is his one weakness, and this is my opinion based on study, and is that he's not real good in his anchor versus speed to power conversion. But every other aspect, he's very good. So obviously you don't get the same kind of speed to power when you're inside because you don't have guys with a runway.
Right. So on Jeff's question, Tyler Guyton is the guy they had in for a visit. They know him. They know the school. Then Lane Johnson obviously knows him, same school. I know it's been well documented how they've got to know each other through the draft process and so forth. But he's a guy that is a developmental tackle. What do I say? The guy's going to go in the first round. How could he be developmental? The guy hasn't played offensive line very long. This guy's a former defensive lineman and a former tight end. So you don't have to rush him. He's a guy you could develop over time. Mary Smith is definitely a long-term project who hasn't played a lot of tackle. Didn't start a lot of games, but he's got a lot of ability. And as we were told yesterday, he absolutely could play right tackle. What makes him not a right tackle? So, okay, left or right tackle. So you talk about their strategy to move this along here. I would say that the Fautanu, I don't see him get. Not only do I not see him getting to 22, it'd be a situation where if Pittsburgh is looking for a tackle, this is not a secret in league circles. If this kid Fautanu starts getting closer to 18, 19, you saw how he do it with Devontae Smith. Great move.
Right.
Again, this is one team, and we've always said this about the Eagles. We don't know why other teams don't value the offensive line quite like they do. will never not have a good offensive line. Has it ever happened since we've done the show? Maybe because of injury. One year I know they had a really bad injury situation, but going into it, they know they want to have a great offensive line. And if one of these guys drop, particularly a guy who could play guard, Botano, that's a guy they trade up for.
Yeah, Greg, Mims and Guyton and Fautano, you wouldn't say that these are three exact carbon copies of each other, correct?
No, the way I would answer the question, we spoke about Fatano briefly. I really like his tape a lot. As I said, the speed to power conversion is the one thing he had trouble with. That may be one reason why people view him as a guard. I could easily make the argument purely based on tape, okay? And I hope people understand that's all I'm basing it on. There's many other factors, and that's the reason neither Mims nor Guyton would be top 10 picks. But I could easily make the argument that the best tackle prospect in this draft class based on tape is Amarius Mims. But he started 8 games and he's hurt all the time. He got hurt at the combine. So you have to decide how you feel about that. Now, for the Eagles, if he's there at 22, that might make sense because barring anything unforeseen, he wouldn't have to start this year anyway.
Right.
You could say the same about Tyler Guyton, who to me would be the second best guy in terms of tape. But, you know, as Adam said, and he's 100% right, you know, he was a tight end. He was an H-back at Oklahoma. He's only started 14 games at right tackle, but he's super gifted. Either one of those guys to me is, you would probably understand that they wouldn't be truly ready to play this year, whoever drafts them. But, you know, if you know, you obviously feel in your building you have the best O-line coach in the league. He's certainly one of the best, regardless, you know, they feel he's the best, as they should. And we've seen the results over the years. So the point is that you draft one of those guys and Stout coaches him, you know, maybe next year, if Lane Johnson does retire, whatever happens, now you've got your right tackle sitting right there, you know, because they both played right tackle in college. So it's not, there's no position change.
Right. Now, Greg, we can't discount. I think there's a perception if the Eagles trade up, it's just for corner. You can never discount them also trading up, as Adam talked about, for a good elite offensive lineman. So I want to ask you about Talisi Fuaga. I hope I pronounced that correctly, from Oregon State, because I believe of all the guys we've talked about, he might have the most guard/tackle versatility, which could make him a starter for the Eagles day one at right guard, correct?
I love this guy's tape. I mean, the only reason he would not be considered a tackle, and he played right tackle at Oregon State for the last 2 years, is arm length. And I spoke to an O-line coach who basically said to me, hey, no one knows the reason, but it's just true that arm length matters. You know, other than the fact that, you know, one's longer and one's shorter, but no one knows, there's no like amazing reason. It's just that, hey, when you go back and look at the history, arm length matters. So he's under 34. He's 33 and an eighth, which would be short for a tackle. But this kid, I mean, he's a man now. I mean, I thought there were times watching him, I thought he was the best O-tackle prospect in the class. I hadn't seen the other guys, you know, yet. But he's got size, strength, athleticism. He's a nasty guy. I mean, this guy was a powerful, competitive, take no prisoners, menace kind of blocker. And don't forget, Oregon State ran purely a pro-style offense, quarterback under center, run game, same principles as an NFL run game. So, you know, this guy, every once in a while, he'd get beat in pass pro because his range wasn't exactly what you wanted. And that's another reason people might see him at guard. But I could see this guy moving inside to guard and being an all-pro guard down the road without question.
Great stuff. All right. It should also be noted the Birds have done a lot of work on natural guards, natural tackles. We're expected to go day 2, day 3. We will ask Greg about them in part 2, again, for our Patreon community. That's patreon.com/InsideTheBirds. In the outside chance the Eagles do not come out of the first round with a cornerback or an offensive line, it could be a different position. And Adam, that is where you in particular have coined the term doomsday scenario, as we recall the 2014 draft, where the guys the Eagles want just started going off the board, and the end result was Marcus Smith. Explain this year how they might be more prepared for that kind of scenario.
Yeah, look, they've looked at the receiver position. To me, I think the receiver position is more about the style of offense that Kellen Moore would like to play, which is heavy 11 personnel. The two top backups are on 1-year deals and have had injury histories. And if Kellen Moore's going to be here a long time, they need better depth. And if you're a base three receiver offense, if that's what you want to do all the time, you know, you need guys who could play who are younger. So I get that. We know that the two starters are studs, but the depth is in question behind the two starters. There's no doubt about it. So they've looked at it. We know they've spent time looking to Xavier Worthy and other receivers and Johnny Wilson, who I'm sort of intrigued with. I know he doesn't run all that well. He's a big guy, but some receivers coaches I talked to would like to coach him around the NFL. So it's not like they've brought a lot of them in, and I still think that it's a long shot, but you just mentioned it. It's the term we've came up with. They got to be ready for when you got 21 picks ahead of you, and you got to be ready because we saw what happened. Was it Marcus Smith was 26 overall, Geoff?
That was the pick. Yes.
Right.
They moved down from 22 when everybody in the Johnny Manziel trade. But then they left themselves even more depleted with options that they wanted and settled on Marcus Smith there.
Right. That's on your point. So, and they thought they had something worked out and the team backed out. So they've got to be ready for doomsday. If something happens, it blows up. Receiver is not obviously a major need, but for the future, and if Kellen Moore's going to be here a long time, he's got to be able to run the offense like he wants to. So I could see that. And then
you got to be ready to pick at 22. That's the bottom line.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it might have to just be the best and highest ranked player on your board. And if it winds up
we hear this every year, and who knows what's going to happen tonight, but every year there's going to be a ton of trades, and maybe there will be. Maybe this is the year. We don't know. But you hear that every year, and there's rarely any trades.
Right. By the way, we had a great participator in our Ask ITB live stream on Patreon the other night say, do you guys remember how bad the Eagles offense already was? And then looked in the playoff game when A.J. Brown left with an injury. And right now, if you look at their number 3 receiver, outside receiver, it would be Devontae Parker, who's not guaranteed by any stretch of the means to make the team. So clearly the best player could be a Xavier Worthy or an Adonai Mitchell. So Greg, before we transition out of receiver, just quick breakdown on the 2 wide receivers from Texas.
Well, I've heard some things. We won't get into off field because Adam, he hears, but I've heard some things. But the point is that A.D. Mitchell is a big time talent. I had a coach tell me, who I respect tremendously, been in the league a long time, that he thinks he's the 3rd best receiver prospect in this draft class. He thinks he's better than Odunze. So, and I love Mitchell. He'd be my 4th. If I had to, make a list, he'd be my 4th. 6'2", 205, ran a 4.34, worked the middle of the field. I mean, this kid is just scratching the surface, in my opinion. He may not be ready day one. I don't, you never, the thing is, you never know that. And we know how the draft goes. The team picks and fans think, well, this guy's going to be an all-pro on his way to the Hall of Fame day one. And if he's not, well, then he's a bust and the team made a bad pick. No one, who was I talking to? Someone said, maybe 1 or 2 guys are successful right away and that it doesn't matter what the fit is, where they go. There's maybe 1 or 2 guys in every draft like that. But other than that, it's fit, it's development. Doesn't mean they can't contribute to some degree, Geoff. But, my guess is A.D. Mitchell, and I love him, it would not be a guy who's going to come in and be your number 3 and catch 70 balls. But he's super, super gifted. I really like this kid a lot. The other one is Worthy. He's a fascinating guy because we know he can run. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But he's a tough kid too. He is not just a fleet outside guy who just doesn't want to get anywhere near the action. He's got some toughness to him. So he's more than just a speed guy. And we see how the league has dramatically changed in that 165-pound receivers. That's not even an issue anymore. I mean, the Eagles drafted Devonta Smith, Tank Dell. Jordan Addison was a first-round pick last year at 173. That issue is no longer an issue in the minds of most teams and evaluators and coaches.
Yeah, Deshaun Jackson opened some doors there for the little wide receiver in the NFL. All right, good stuff, Greg. I want to just focus on the last position that you can never discount with the Eagles, especially in the first round. That's edge rusher. The names here to watch would be UCLA's Leitu Latu and Penn State's Chop Robinson. Both of them were among the team's 30 visits. As for Leitu, it's well known he had a neck injury at Washington, ended his career there, forced him into a brief retirement. Washington did not medically clear him, so he eventually transferred to UCLA. He did get medical clearance, and he emerged into one of the country's best pass rushers and last year's Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. And just for our perspective, for what Adam and I can add, we've talked to some teams that are leery of taking him in the first round, talked to some other teams that are concerned but not against it. As far as the Eagles, as we understand it, comfortable with his tape enough to draft him, prefer it not to be round one. It's all, as Adam has said, it's all about, do you envision him being able to make it through to a second contract, right, Adam? That's usually in
Yeah.
these cases what it's about, because the talent is undeniably there.
Because if you're, the way you explained to me the other day is, if you're a team that's kind of really good like the Eagles, and maybe not elite but good, and you want to take the next step, if you, as long as you think the guy could get like 5 years in, why not do it? I mean,
Right.
if you could, you know, Greg will get in a second, we'll get into what the tape shows us. But man, if he's as good as people say he is, without the medical issue, he's a top 10 pick, probably. Geez, where do I sign up if I think he could play 5 years?
Yeah, 100%. And some guys have been able to beat the rap on them, so to say. You know, Josh Sweat's a good example. There were concerns there, and he's made it to a second contract and played pretty well up until last year's drop off. So, Greg, let's talk about Latu from UCLA, edge rusher, and Robinson. Can you give us a breakdown of both of them, what you like and what you see them from them on tape?
Well, let's start with Latu. He
Mhm.
was my favorite edge player in the draft. He's a really refined edge pass rusher. You rarely see that in college. I mean, you're dealing with a guy that has a lot of tools in his toolbox. I mean, this guy he knows how to use his hands. He's got moves. He can motorcycle lean at the top of the pass rush arc, because he can bend his body. He can flatten his rush path. He can accelerate. He's competitive. He's got a high motor. I really like this kid a lot. To me, he very much reminded me of TJ Watt coming out of Wisconsin. Now, keep in mind, TJ Watt did not have 20 or 25 sacks in Wisconsin. You know, obviously people are thinking now, TJ Watt, oh my God, what are you saying? I'm talking about when TJ Watt came out of Wisconsin. But this kid, to me, you have to decide. You know, you guys laid it out. I can't add to that about the medical. You got to decide how you feel about that. I mean, this guy's got the most complete pass rush arsenal in the draft class. And when you combine that with his excellent athleticism and flexibility, you have a really strong pass rush profile. Chop Robinson, on the other hand, and Geoff, you know, he's a Penn Stater, so you know him. He is the most purely explosive, but he needs a lot of work. I mean, this guy, when you just talk about explosion, though, this guy's silly. But he doesn't really have a lot to him beyond the fact that he's going to try to run around the tackle. And he did run around the tackle a lot in college. Oftentimes he got there after the ball was thrown, which is not his fault, which is why, you know, people say, well, he didn't produce. You got to be careful about that. You need tape study gives you context of players. You know, think of Danielle Hunter. Danielle Hunter had 4.5 sacks in 3 years at LSU. So for the people that say, well, I like production, you know, then you're not drafting Danielle Hunter, and the guy's got almost 100 sacks in the NFL. So you got the tape gives you a context of how a guy plays. You know, Robinson is explosive as all get off, but he needs to work on a lot of counter moves. He doesn't really have a toolbox. I almost see him, and it may not fit the Eagles unless Vic, you know, obviously we have to think now about a different potential style of defense. I almost see Robinson, and this is not a direct comparison. I'm just talking deployment. I almost see Robinson like Micah Parsons, and you move him around because he's such an explosive athlete. You want him with a runway. You know, you want him to be able to use that burst, that explosion, that accelerating speed. And while you're working with him on the edge, you know, and developing the fact that he needs more. But, you know, there's not many guys with his just purely explosive traits.
Yeah, you want to play go get quarterback with him and not make it too difficult, right? I mean,
yeah, and
find mismatches too by moving him around. You can find mismatches.
I mean, look, you know, when Vic has a background with that, think of someone like Van Ginkel, who was in Miami, you know, with Vic, who he moved around quite a bit. And Chop Robinson's a more explosive athlete than Van Ginkel, who's a good football player, but Chop's a more explosive athlete. You know, you think of that, you know, to me, he'd be that kind of guy, you know, particularly early in his career.
Excellent. All right, one guy. We'll close on this because we have to ask about this one guy, because who in the world knows where he's going to go? He is the only tight end you're going to see drafted in the first round, Brock Bowers. Greg, I know I didn't alert you on this, but I feel like we can't.
I feel
like you might have seen his tape.
Detail, Geoff. Yeah, He's not a guy I missed, believe me.
What do you
Yeah.
think?
I think he's phenomenal. I mean, I think that it's hard to focus on one trait because he's really good. And the thing that really stood out to me, which, is very rare, his transition from catching the football to run after catch was as seamless as I've ever seen. I mean, this guy, he has open field balance, he has strength, he has elusiveness, he's got burst, he's got long speed. There's nothing he doesn't have. And by the way, Georgia demands that tight ends block. So when people say, well, he can't block, that's not true. There's a difference between saying a guy can't block versus he's not a great blocker. Bowers blocks. It means something to him. You can see that watching the tape. He's just 243, but he tries really hard and he's not bad at it. And he's committed to it because that's just the kind of kid he is. But as a receiver, the thing about tight ends is you almost have to have a feel for how you want to deploy them. And I would imagine a lot of people would look at Andy Reid's offense to see how that all plays out with Kelsey, because it's not just, oh, he's a tight end, so we're going to do what we normally do with a tight end. He's just a different cat, and you got to figure out exactly how you want to deploy him.
Absolutely. All right, Greg, great stuff. We thank you so much for joining us on part 1 of the show. Remember, you can catch the rest of our conversation with Greg on the day 2 and 3 prospects on our Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/InsideTheBirds. We're going to move on to part 2 of our show and introduce our next guest. We're really excited today to be joined by the Reese's Senior Bowl Executive Director, Jim Nagy. You can follow him on Twitter or X at Jim Nagy_SB, SB for Senior Bowl. Jim, you and your staff, you guys do a phenomenal job running the Senior Bowl. So the first thing we want to do is express our appreciation for all that you do with it, that you've done with it, and of course for being on the show today. So thanks and glad to have you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I appreciate that. Yeah, our staff works really hard. So we've tried to do a lot of things over the years to make this a better game. It's been a great game forever. It's been the best All-Star game forever. But we've certainly worked hard to make things better.
Yeah, and you're the perfect person, Jim, to have on because, the Eagles have a long-standing history of taking players who participated in the Senior Bowl. We're talking about going back to Brandon Graham and Lane Johnson, Carson Wentz, and of course, last year alone, both of their 3rd-round picks, Sidney Brown and Tyler Steen, were Senior Bowl participants. So there's always a lot to talk about with the Eagles, with other NFL teams, and you have had over 120 kids there, correct? Is that the right number?
We had 138 this year. We've kind of had to build our number out because we've had some player attrition on game day the last couple of years. It's kind of a growing issue. So we've had to expand the rosters, but yeah, we've had right at 40 or 41% of the last 3 drafts. So we've had over 100 players drafted each of the last 3 years. Now that we can bring the juniors, like I said, I think we had 18 juniors ended up in Mobile this year. So I'm hoping that number inches closer to 50% of the draft. I hope we're up there like 46, 47, 48% once we get through this weekend.
So Jim, you have an interesting background. So you were a scout. You worked in the league for a long time. You've been running the Senior Bowl now for a bit. From a scouting perspective, how much value should we put into 3 days of practice? Because we have tapes obviously from the season. You have pro day workouts. You've got the combine, all that. So of everything that you do, because you have this perspective, how much value and what do we get out of the Senior Bowl?
Yeah, Adam, it's a good question. Obviously, the fall tape to me is always the most important thing. But I think the guys that come to Mobile, especially nowadays, with a lot of people in their ears telling them to play it safe and not get hurt and everything else. I think the guys that play down here and play in the game, especially, like they make a real statement. They make a statement to the guys in the league. And I just got off the phone this morning with a GM that said the same thing. He's like, man, we value those guys that stick it out and play in the game. It speaks to how they're wired. And again, the other value is just seeing these guys in different roles. There's been a lot of players over the last handful of years. We just finished up my 6th game here at the Senior Bowl. So you get guys that were career tackles in college that come down here and rep at center all week and end up being starting centers in the league. We got, you get kind of like box safety type players like Jalen Petrie a couple years ago with the Texans, and we played him deep the whole week. and played him in man coverage, which you never saw him do at Baylor. So we try to put these guys in situations and let these teams see some things they can't see on the college tape. To me, those are the guys that really benefit most.
And we saw that last year with the Eagles picks, right? Tyler Steen was a tackle. He played guard, I believe, at the Senior Bowl, and Sidney Brown, just like Petrie, was a box safety who you guys put in different coverage responsibilities to see him there. Want to ask, let's start off with offensive line, Jim. And by the way, just so everybody knows, we're going to try to make it through cordially here. You're a Michigan guy. I'm a Penn State guy. Adam's got no horse in the race. He's a Temple guy, so it's okay. But we'll try to make it through this cordially and be all right. I wanted to ask you about offensive linemen. You had a bunch of them there at the Senior Bowl. The one guy that really sticks out, and when you talk about the Eagles picking at 22, and this guy might be there and fits a lot of their athletic profile, would be a Tyler Guyton. And I wanted to know what you learned about him going into the process and what you saw about him at the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, it's a good question. I felt like this was our, we usually do well on the offensive line. Like, it's not hard to convince those guys to come here. If you look historically, year in and year out, that's probably our best position group. And this was, I feel like, our best class. We had 10 first rounders my first year here. 5 were offensive linemen. I think we'll beat that 5 this year. I think we'll have more than 5, at least 5. But I've said, going back to last summer, I think Tyler Guyton's the most athletic tackle in this draft. Not saying he's going to go first, and not saying he's the best prospect, but is he the most athletic and have the highest ceiling of any of these guys? I think he does, and I think he is. He just looks different on tape than all these other guys. He floats. I mean, the background playing tight end at TCU, he didn't do a lot of it, but he lined up at tight end at TCU, and you see that in his background. So his best football is way ahead of him. He played right tackle there, kind of out of necessity at Oklahoma. Could have come out last year, honestly. He just didn't have a lot of starts. I think it was smart that he came back, but he was playing behind Wanye Morris, who was a 3rd-round pick to Kansas City, played in the Senior Bowl, and then Anton Harrison on the other side at left tackle was, 1st-round pick to the Jags. So he was playing behind 2 good people. So I think it was smart that he came back, and I think the one thing he showed down here, he played on the left side. He'd always been kind of a right side player. So I don't know what the Eagles would be thinking about doing there. Probably the succession plan for Lane, I would think, with Lane, who we put in our Hall of Fame a couple summers ago, last summer. It was cool. It was cool having Lane back here. But yeah, to me, that's a great succession plan. I think Jeff Stoutland could do wonders for Tyler. He's not the finished product, and having him sit behind a year and kind of learn and just watch how Lane approaches his job for a year or 2, I think that would be great. That would be great for Tyler's development.
So, Jim, a guy who has had quite the offseason is Quinyon Mitchell from Toledo, who is, for our money, everyone we've talked to says he's the #1 corner for this draft. What did the Senior Bowl do for him from being around him and obviously from the practices?
Yeah, it's crazy, Adam. We used to refer to small school players as like sub FBS guys, right? I mean, we had a lot of FCS, D2s, a couple D3s over my time here. But now, because of the portal, I mean, group of 5 players are essentially small school players now. It's kind of crazy. And there's a lot of good football being played there. But, I saw something the other day that the MAC hasn't had a 1st-round pick since 2017. And while over the course of his career, he's covered some good people, Western Michigan's had a couple good receivers, but he needed to come down here and prove he could do it against, high level players. And on that North squad, that national squad that he was on, I mean, you had Ricky Pearsall and Roman Wilson and Tez Walker. I mean, he Luke McCaffrey, he matched up against some really good people. And I think that's what put him over the top. I think coming into the week, he probably would have been a late 1st-round pick, maybe early 2nd. And now it sounds like he could go somewhere, in that 10 to 12, 13 range. And like I said, everyone I've talked to has him as the #1 corner on the board. You get a guy with his skill set. And one thing you saw him do in Mobile that you didn't see a lot at Toledo is press man. I think he's a really physical kid, really strong guy. Goes to the combine, runs 4.33. So Q's had a great process. He's really kind of checked every box along the way.
Yeah, Jim, as reporters, Adam and I and everybody else who's there, we're kind of living 2 lives as watching the Senior Bowl going on and also trying to, catch up with people and network. It was impossible to not notice the one-on-ones you mentioned between Quinyon Mitchell and the Michigan receiver, Roman Wilson, right? I mean, those were the early highlights of that and how fiercely competitive they were, and then respectful toward each other after. I thought that was just great competition.
Yeah, no, those two seem to get matched up quite a bit. And then at the end of I want to say it was the second day of practice, the coaching staff did kind of a competitive thing where they let a guy call out a guy on the other squad to go against. And I can't remember if Quinion called out Roman or Roman called out Quinion, but yeah, they had some really good battles.
Another guy, Jim, there, who we'll see where he goes, but Max Melton balled out there. I was like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on him for this draft? Because I know he's got a lot of versatility in his tool chest, as they say.
Yeah, we had Max's brother Bo in the game a few years back, and it was really ironic because Bo was on the practice squad in Seattle, and that's where I was. That was my last job before coming here to the Senior Bowl. And I'd reached out to him once Max accepted his invite. I was like, "Hey, man, we got your brother," and I was really excited about it. And then we kind of had a back and forth. And I just told, I told Bo, stick it out, man. Things are going to happen for you. And then he gets picked up by the Packers, and as good a rookie year as Jaden Reed had. He had 11 touchdowns as a rookie, and he had all those guys: Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, all those guys. Bo Melton had the only 100-yard receiving game last year for the Green Bay Packers. So,
Wow.
so that's cool. Going into, you asked me about Max, I talk about Bo, but no, Max is a guy that I was really high on in the fall. I'm glad that he's kind of built some steam through the process. Sounds like he's going to be a top 50 player right now. But the thing I loved about him, similar to what Bo was at receiver, like he's just a football player. You can play him inside, you can play him outside. He was an elite tester like his brother. Just a really scrappy dude, gets his hands on balls. Like Rutgers does a really good job. They don't, traditionally push a ton of guys to the league, but the guys they do push to the league usually make it. So, I just love the competitive makeup of Max. I think he's going to play right away for somebody.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. Rutgers, they do have a history, especially under Schiano, for churning out good defensive backs in the NFL. Obviously, the Schiano tree, the Belichick-Schiano tree there. We can talk about Logan Ryan and the twins, the McCourty twins.
Yep.
Do you notice that when you look at Rutgers defensive backs who played for Schiano, that they are a little bit more advanced in not just being physically talented, but understanding coverages and routes and things of that nature?
Yeah, for sure. No, they do a great job at that position. And I think the other thing you get is, on top of the scheme stuff and everything they ask them to do, is you're getting tough guys. All those guys you mentioned were smart, tough football players. I think that's why all those guys played a long time. I mean, Devin was in the game. He was on our ballot this year for our 75th anniversary team. So that goes back a ways. But I think I was still, was I still in? No, I was already gone from New England when we picked him. But yeah, you know what you're getting. You're getting a guy, Coach Schiano runs a tough program, very competitive, very demanding. And at DB, I mean, there's some programs where you're not going to get that kind of guy. So I think teams feel good about going into Rutgers and taking DBs.
Jim, every now and then there's someone at the Senior Bowl you're not familiar with, and I was not aware of the school, Houston Christian, but they had a pass rusher. I don't know how you pronounce his first name, but his last name is Hunt. Where did you find this kid?
Yeah, Jalix Hunt. Well, you didn't know about Houston Christian because up until about a year ago, they were Houston Baptist.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So they switched to Houston Christian. But Jalix was a guy that was on our radar over the summer. We'll start doing it here, cranking up in June. We do small school Saturdays every summer, every Saturday in the summer. Jalix was one of those guys we profiled last year and really has a cool background. He was up in the Ivy League. He was at Cornell. He was a backup safety. So then he goes to Houston Christian. The kid keeps growing. He just keeps growing into his frame, and he's big and long, and had a great year there. We saw him play live over at Southeast Louisiana, which isn't too far from Mobile here. Sent a scout over there to see him, and I know he had a really good year. And I think what he showed here at the Senior Bowl, a couple things that really make you excited about the player, is he's got this really nice, long, athletic frame. And then for a former DB, he showed an incredible level of physicality. When they were doing like edge set drills in the run game, I remember I want to say it was Javon Foster from Missouri. Like, they came off that first rep and it was loud. And you can't coach that. Like, this kid's got an innate physicality to him that you're going to need to be an edge player in the NFL. And there was no back down from the kid. He came here. He was really excited to compete against the big boys. And then he's got some natural pass rush to him too. I think he had 6.5, 7 sacks this year at Houston Christian. But when you saw him during the week, like some of the natural counter stuff, when he gets cut off, It's hard, that stuff's hard to coach. So he's got an element of power and physicality. He's got kind of a natural rush to him. So I'm talking 2 or 3 years down the line, probably not as a rookie. You might really have something. I think he's going to be in there. There's a tackle at Yale, Kieran Amagaji, who I think it's going to be Jalix or him is the top, small school player drafted this year, probably somewhere in that 4th round, late 3, early 4. So yeah, he's a cool football player. And while he transitions with the athlete and the physicality and the toughness, like he's going to be a really good special teams player for somebody.
Jim, let's stick with pass rushers, edge guys. We know one guy that Eagles really like, and it really, as we know, it'll just come down to medical situation with him because of his neck injury in college. Is Latu Latu from UCLA, a guy that a lot of teams really like as far as being refined, hand usage. What did you see from him at the Senior Bowl prospect? What have you learned about him?
Yeah, well, one thing you learn when a guy that's projected to be a top 10 to 15 pick and he still chooses to come to Mobile, I think that says a lot about him. It really does. And with the medical stuff, I feel like people on social media have been a little harped on that a little bit because they feel like they have some inside intel, right? Like usually the outside world doesn't know much about these kids' medicals. So, I mean, I just feel like he's been kind of harshly judged because of the medicals. Everyone feels like they know this guy. All it takes is one team. And you can go back. I went back through guys I've scouted. Mike Williams, the receiver who Chargers receiver went to the Jets. He had a neck thing. I mean, there's been a lot of guys. We had Damone Clark, for a linebacker from LSU in the game a couple years ago, and got diagnosed with a neck thing at the combine, actually. Probably would have been a 2nd-round pick. Dallas took him in the 5th. He had to sit out a good chunk of his rookie year, and now he starts for the Dallas Cowboys. So neck things aren't anything new. Obviously, the UCLA doctors felt good enough. But back to the skill set, I mean, he is so advanced, man. Like, he is so skilled and slippery, like the hand usage. He's almost like a martial artist. And they've done a great job with him. His coaches have done a great job with him. He is a guy that's never out of a rush, is like what I like to say. Like, you can cut off his first move, stymie his second move, and then he just like transitions into a third move. He's relentless. He's slippery. He's got a really nice first step. I think there's very few rookies that even, come close to double digits sacks as rookies. I think he could be that guy next year for somebody. He's as ready-made an NFL pass rusher as we've seen in a while.
Jim, I want to turn our attention to quarterback, and Michael Penix is just, I love watching him throw. I know people bring up the medical. I get it. Yeah. It's part of his history, but you've worked for teams. When you look at multiple knee injuries, I know he had the shoulder issue, and then you compare it to the tape, which is quite interesting. How do you look at his future as an NFL quarterback?
Yeah, my first exposure to Michael was, God, it feels like 3 or 4 years ago, a long time ago. He was still in Indiana. I was at the Manning camp over summer a few years ago. And like you said, he is fun to watch throw the football. I tried to make that point on social media, but coming into Senior Bowl week, for everyone that hadn't seen Michael Penix throw live, like, get ready, because it's
really
fun.
cool.
It's fun, man. He can chuck it. Yeah, the medical's the medical. I mean, Howie and everyone in Philly, they're bringing in the doctors. That's what they're paid to do. But one thing Michael's proven he can do over the last 2 years at Washington, he can win from the pocket. And I've just worked for too many coaches and too many teams that they harp on that. Yes, you need to be able to get out and create, for sure. But coaches prefer guys that'll sit in there and play from the pocket, because then it'll reduce injury. But I think where Michael helped himself in the process, maybe the most, was running that, mid 4.5 in the 40, depending on what scout you talk to. I mean, guys I reached out to are 4.52 to 4.58. I mean, that's cooking pretty good for a quarterback. So it's not like he can't get out of harm's way. He's just comfortable sitting back there and picking you apart. So I know there's been a lot of growing kind of buzz over the last month or so that Michael could end up in that middle part of round 1. I think that, the Saints, Raiders, there's that group of teams there, Denver. It'll be interesting, but he's had a really two really good years there in Washington, and he stayed healthy. He's been on the field 2 years in a row. So we'll see where it goes, but I'm pulling for him.
Yeah, let's stay with the quarterbacks there, because you had Michael Penix, you had Bo Nix at the Senior Bowl, you had the Tulane quarterback, Michael Pratt. Spencer Rattler wound up being the game's MVP. And did I miss anybody else as far as day 1, day 2 type prospects that you had there?
No, that'll be it. I mean, I think for most teams, everyone's talking about the top 6 guys. And then regardless of what team you talk to, I haven't talked to anybody that doesn't have Rattler or Pratt 7 and 8. I mean, there's
Mhm.
been a different order. Like some teams prefer Rattler over Pratt and vice versa, but those guys are pretty much everybody's consensus 7 and 8.
What did you learn just going about that group of quarterbacks that you had, and who do you think helped themselves the most? I mean, I don't want to. Rattler won MVP, so I think everybody could just say, well, that, but I don't know if you saw it differently.
Yeah, I think Spencer probably did. You know, Michael Pratt's an interesting guy because he's right down the road from us in New Orleans. It's only a couple hours. I went there to his first game of the year, and I think he was 14 of 15 for 300 and some yards and 4 touchdowns. And I left the stadium that night. I knew we were going to invite him. And I love Michael Pratt that he elevated that Tulane program. I think we get lost nowadays that used to be a big deal. Like when I started scouting, like we used to really dig into guys that raised a program. And Michael Pratt certainly done that. Went head to head with Caleb Williams 2 years ago in the Cotton Bowl and got a win for Tulane. And the one game he missed this year was Ole Miss. I mean, they probably would have went back to a New Year's Six game had he played because they almost won without him.
Mm-hmm.
So no, Michael had a good week, but I think Rattler probably helped himself the most of the quarterbacks. Was probably the most consistent day in and day out in terms of getting the ball out and being accurate, and then he kept it off with a really good game. But I don't think anyone's ever doubted Spencer's talent. We've talked about this guy for years, being the former 5-star, and then there's been a lot of talk about the Netflix special. I never even watched it. But I think going to Columbia, South Carolina was a really nice reset for Spencer. You talked to all the people down there, Shane Beamer and his crew.
Mm-hmm.
Spencer's grown up a lot, man. We got to give these kids. I mean, he was a 17-year-old kid on that show. And again, there's a lot of people going back and watching that and harping on this guy. I mean, I know I was a lot different at 22 than I was at 17, and I'm sure you guys were too.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of personal growth. And I'll say this for a lot of guys in this class. You look at some of the quarterbacks that have failed recently. I just did something to the ESPN over the weekend for Outside the Lines. We're talking about, like, why does the league keep whiffing on these guys? And I think what a big component of it is, like, we don't know how they're going to handle failure. A lot of these guys have just cruised through life and everything's been easy and they've won everywhere and they've never really, had to battle through much. You look at this class, like Bo Nix having to pick up from Auburn, where he grew up, his dad being a quarterback there. Like, that was his dream, to be an Auburn Tiger.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically got ran out of town. I mean, living here in the state, like, I felt it. Like, he became the, he was the fan base's guy. They were blaming him, even though to me, it wasn't him. But he had to reset and go. Spencer Rattler had to reset and go. Michael Penix overcoming all the injury stuff. Like, that's not easy to sit in a training room for 3 years in a row, separated from your teammates. You talk to any player, that's the hardest thing they have to go through. So there's some guys in this class that have really been through a lot. And I know, just talking to, friends around the league, they feel good about some of these guys because they know they're kind of battle tested, if you will. Like, they're not gonna face it at the next level and shrink. So that's cool. That's some cool stuff on these guys.
Jim, one thing on the practice, because I was curious, because you mentioned this, and I know some DBs coaches mentioned this. They love seeing Mitchell play up and play man. What are the rules for practice in terms of blitzing and zone versus man? I didn't realize that they played man coverage or practice man coverage. What are the rules during the practices?
Yeah, no rules really against coverage in practice. We don't blitz in the game. We're trying to keep those quarterbacks healthy, let them get through the game. But no, there's no coverage rules. And now that we don't have the full coaching staffs anymore, we kind of have a collective staff of all the non-playoff teams. I give those guys all the autonomy. Like these D coordinators, like, they're coming down and they're trying to, be in a new role. They're usually elevated, or these head coaches are being elevated from coordinator to head coach. I want these guys to put their own stamp on this game. So there's no rules, and that's traditionally, Adam, that's always been going back to, I think my first Senior Bowl is '98. I mean, this Mobile is like the first time you see any of these guys press. I mean, there's some teams in the SEC, right, the LSUs, the Alabamas, that you see people get up in their face and put their hands on them, but a lot of places don't. And again, it's not always going to look perfect. Press technique is hard. But I think it's like the willingness, when they actually do get their hands on people, you can see footwork, you can see quickness, reactiveness, and then when they put their hands on people, can they choke them? So I think it's a huge takeaway from this week.
Jim, as a longtime follower of yours on social media, I know that you like to promote guys who are not necessarily household names, who really acquit themselves well at the Senior Bowl. Recently, you were talking about a guy that the Eagles have shown a lot of interest in on the offensive line, TCU offensive lineman Brandon Coleman. And another guy they have showed interest in is the Washington tackle, Roger Rosengarten. What did you learn about both of those guys during their time in Mobile?
Yeah, Geoff, I like to do that because there's a lot of names every year. Like this year was Braden Fisk from Florida State and Darius Robinson from Missouri. Like those were easy ones. And I will let you in on a secret. Like nobody watches less of what's going on in the field during Senior Bowl week than myself. I'm usually putting out fires and doing certain things and just catching up with buddies from around the league and hearing how everything's going during the week. So one of my favorite weeks of the year is the week after the Senior Bowl, when we can all sit in the office as a staff and grind through the tape. And then you really see there's some guys that you don't hear anything about during Senior Bowl week. And you're like, man, this guy had an awesome week. Rosengarten was one of those guys. And then I've been a huge fan of Brandon Coleman going back to last summer. I just think he's, as a guard, he played a lot of tackle there. I think he's more of a guard prospect, but he's a huge human being inside, really long, 10 and 5/8 hands. I posted a video yesterday of him going against Braden Fisk. Like you see the hand size. Like there's something, we always talk about it with quarterbacks, but you talk to any offensive line coach, they want a guy with big mitts. And Brandon, like I get buy-in with these guys, and this goes back to my time scouting. I went to Fort Worth in August, and they had an early morning practice. Something happened early in the day. So, this was an 8 a.m. practice. So something happened really early with the offensive line coach. He was not happy to start the practice. He called the group up, kind of read them the riot act. And I don't know, someone was late for an early morning lift or something.
Sure.
And, he chewed them all out. And then we got about halfway through practice, and Brandon wasn't happy with how practice was going. So he calls the offensive line up, and he chews them himself. I just love seeing guys take ownership of their position group at practice. So that stuck with me. Right. And then we had Steve Avila in the game last year, who had an unbelievable year, all rookie year for the LA Rams. And these two guys are best friends. They're cut from the same cloth. So when teams are looking into that kind of stuff, like we always used to dig it. Who does this guy hang out with? Like, who are his friends on the team?
Mm-hmm.
Because, birds of a feather. Right. And so I think that's helping Brandon. So I think Brandon's going to be a really good pro. I think he could be a day one starter. And then Rosengarten, we talk about flipping sides. Like Troy Fatanu was the left tackle, going to be a first-round pick. Had committed to play in the Senior Bowl before his agents pulled him out. I love his agency group, so I'm not mad. But Roger played a ton on the left side here, which you never saw him do on Washington tape, and he was really good. Like he might have been better on the left side than he was on the right side down here.
Wow.
So he's a guy that at minimum could be your swing tackle next year. But I think he's going to be a long-term starter, and I think he proved down here he could legitimately play on the left side.
So, Jim, there's a guy who hails from Mobile, and you would know better than I cannot remember if Bryce Huff was in the Senior Bowl, and he was not drafted out of Memphis.
You're bringing up a really sore subject, Adam.
I'm sorry. I got to ask you. I got to do it. I've been wanting to ask you this question. In fact, I know his head coach, Ryan Summerfield, really well. I got to call Ryan. Why wasn't he drafted? The answer that, look, he wasn't drafted. So, look. It is what it is. What was the issue with him coming out of college that you recall?
So, yes, Bryce Huff is a Mobile native, went to St. Paul's High School here in town, which I live about 2 minutes from. And actually, on our staff that year, one of our scouting assistants played high school ball with Bryce Huff. So our goal every year is to get every player drafted, right? It doesn't always happen that way. But we're trying to bring it, first and foremost, we're trying to bring everyone the league wants to see. So that's part of our process as well. Like we had 11 former NFL scouts this year, and we do all our own work, but then we do grade sharing calls with teams in November. We usually do it with about half the league, and the teams are really open, and we just have, good back and forth on these players. So I didn't think Bryce was going to get picked. Probably should have taken the hometown guy anyway. I'll say this, like huge whiff on my part. I own it. My mistake. So cool that I heard he got the highest UDFA deal for an undrafted rookie in franchise in league history, which is incredible. But back to Ryan, trust me, Ryan Silverfield called me that year to push Bryce as well. So that makes it even worse. But
Sorry, man.
and he came home for a game that fall. He came to play South Alabama. Like he was here. We saw him play here. But no, I think teams just got, really bogged down in kind of the measurables. There was some tightness to them. Like if we're just being nitpicky and being really open on the evaluation, he was a rocked up kid. He was kind of muscle bound in his movements. He really was kind of thought he was a designated pass rusher. And I thought he fit like the old school Steelers, Arizona Cardinals, sawed off 3-4 outside linebacker, Lamar Woodley, Joey Porter,
There you go.
kind of in that vein of a player. And so we whiffed, but he had a lot of power. That's the one thing he had get off and he had power. And there's a guy in this year's draft who I've said it since the time we got him on board, Javon Solomon at Troy University, led the country in sacks this year. I was not going to make that mistake again. He reminds me a lot of Bryce Huff coming out, and probably a little looser as an athlete. So Javon Solomon had 16 sacks this year, really from a 4-eye position. He was aligning tight to the tackle on most of his sacks. And he's flying under radars right now. I'd probably go early day 3, 4th, 5th round. But if I'm in a draft room right now and I'm the Southeast guy that did Javon Solomon, who is one of my favorite kids we had in Mobile, one of the highest character guys ever, his head coach, John Summerall, who's at Tulane now, one of his favorite, maybe his favorite player he's ever coached based off conversations with John. Like I would be pounding the table for Javon Solomon. And I would be using the Bryce Huff example. Like we all missed on Bryce Huff. Like let's not do it again.
Jim, he wasn't drafted.
Yeah, the league missed on him too.
Yeah. The whole league missed on him. So like that would be my point in draft meetings. Like guys, let's not miss on this. Let's not miss on a guy like this again. Because even if he falls short of being Bryce Huff and he's not like a 15 sack guy, he's still got like a 10 sack guy. So it's a great pick. So yeah, man, I'm happy to. That's really cool that Bryce he's going to the Eagles and he how he paid him really well. Mr. Lurie paid him really well. I'm happy for him.
A couple other guys, Jim, as we wrap this up, that the Eagles showed interest. We got to talk about the defense a little bit because this is an area the Eagles really need to hit hard. If they don't get a corner in the first round, one guy who stood out to me, and maybe it was because the helmet that he was wearing seemed different than the rest of his teammates, was the kid from Kentucky, the corner, Andrew Phillips, who he just stood out. I was watching him play. I thought he competed pretty well. And then, of course, Trevin Wallace, the linebacker, also from Kentucky. But Andrew, I think he had like the more silvery helmet. It kept glaring in the sun to me. So he stood out a little bit there.
Yeah, he did. Andrew is one of my personal favorites from this draft. I think going into Senior Bowl week, people were hesitant, like, how good is this cornerback class? You saw a lot of people knocking the class. I thought a lot of guys elevated coming out of the week, and Andrew is one of those guys. Super competitive. We talked about Max Melton and how he's wired coming out of that Rutgers program. I think Andrew's the same way. I think you can play him inside. I think what gets lost on nickel corners is how tough they need to be, because if you're inside and you're soft and you don't want to play the run, teams are just good. Teams know that they're going to scout you. They're just going to check to the run and run right at you. So Andrew Phillips can play inside. Again, just like Melton, he tested really well. He can play outside. He's certainly fast enough. Had some really good reps outside against some really fast receivers down here. Matched a lot of really fast 4-3 guys down the field and found the football, made plays. So yeah, he was kind of a sleeper, but I think he's solidly on day 2 now. Like if you're not going corner and 1 and you're looking to get a guy that could start on day 2, Phillips will be one of those guys.
Is he inside outside or purely one spot on the field, do you think?
No, I think he play both. That's why I like him so much. That's why I think he and Melton are similar. You're going to be able to plug him in and find a spot. Like he's going to be one of your top 3. And I think he can play both.
Jim, do clubs when you talk to them, meet with them? I know you know so many people in scouting, but do they pick your brain about, okay, what's this guy like in the meetings? What was this guy like around you? Do they hit you up for that kind of information?
Yeah, all the time. I just had a GM text me this morning. He's like, "Hey, can you shoot me a list of guys that were like your favorite guys?" I said, and I told him, I said, "You guys have done the eval part. Like, you don't need that from me." But in terms of guys that our onboarding process starts, is right away. As soon as they accept the invite in November, December, we start to have communication with them. So, and there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot of stuff they need to fill out. There's psychological tests they take before they even get to Mobile, things of that nature. So guys that were like low maintenance through that process, had good energy during the week. Like when I saw them in the hotel, saw them in meetings, feedback from the coaches we had here. And then the guys that were just competitive, guys that were competitive in practice, guys that were competitive in the game. Guys that I would want in my locker room and build the locker room out. That's what they want to know.
Gotcha.
Like, who would you, if you were us, who would you want in your locker room? And that's what this GM wanted this morning. And I shot him, I don't know, 12, 15 names of guys that if I were in his shoes, I'd want on my football team.
Gotcha.
On that vein, can you give us a couple of safeties that you felt would be good? Obviously the Eagles run a Fangio style defense because their defensive coordinator is now Vic Fangio, but and that's an important position in his defense. Some guys that you think I can give you names of guys the Eagles have looked at, but they've actually looked at so many people at that position, including Senior Bowl guys, that we'd be here forever. So a couple of names that stood out to you.
Yeah, well, going back to last year, Sidney Brown was one of my favorite guys in last year's draft.
Everybody says that.
Yeah. Howie and I actually talked about it before the draft. He would have been a guy I would want in my locker room. So I hope he's going to bounce back off that ACL because I think he's going to be a great player for the Eagles. But I'm trying to think off the top of my head some of the safeties. Malik Mustafa from Wake Forest is a really urgent, fun football player to watch on tape. I mean, this kid triggers and blows stuff up. If you remember TJ Ward, we're going back in time a little now, the former Oregon Ducks safety. Yep. Denver Broncos, Cleveland Browns. Like, to me, he reminds me a lot of TJ Ward. Cole Bishop from Utah, I thought had a really good week, and I thought played himself into maybe the third round. He's probably, going back to our calls in November, most teams had him in that fringe top 100. And then at the combine, when he ran 4.45, I was out with guys from 3 teams. I put this out on Twitter as well. I said, "How about Bishop?" And all 3 of them agreed he's not getting out of the second round. And that was all the way back, at the beginning of March. And I know he's had a great process since. So like Cole Bishop, and then the other 2 that I posted some about recently, Javon Bullard and Tyke Smith from Georgia, I think are guys that, again, there were people in Bullard's ear telling him not to come to the Senior Bowl. I know that for a fact. And his agents pushed him to come. Hats off to his agents, and he had a great week. He was DB of the week, voted on by the other team's receivers and quarterbacks. And then and Tyke really helped himself because he was a nickel there at Georgia, and we played him deep. And so people saw a guy that could really legitimately play safety. He's just a really good football player. And then both those guys went to Indy and ran high 4.4s. So those are a few. I mean, we could go on, and I think Evan Williams from Oregon is kind of an under the radar name that a lot of scouts are trying to keep quiet right now because he's one of their favorite guys, just super instinctive, kind of for Eagles fans, like Reed Blankenship, like in terms of like instinctive guy, good football player, around the football a lot, knows, has a nose for the ball, sees it really well, anticipates. I think he had 2 picks in our game. I know he had one incredible pick on a range play on Joe Milton. And then you go back over the practice week, and he did some really good stuff in man coverage. So that group ended up being a little better than I thought it was going to be as well. Once we got through all the Senior Bowl and the testing, I think safety is a little deeper than people maybe thought it was at the start of the process.
One more thing for you. You mentioned Reed Blankenship. He's been a great story of development. Just got a nice little contract extension. Jim, why was he not drafted?
He falls into the Bryce Huff category for us as well. I'm not just talking out of my butt here. If you go back and if you search Twitter on Reed Blankenship, I mean, I was putting stuff on him the summer before, and I don't usually put stuff out on players that I don't like. And I think I would never want to create false hope in a player. Just like right now, when I'm putting stuff about our guys and where they're going to get drafted, that's based off stuff I'm getting from teams. Like managing expectations for these players, I'm the last guy that should be putting out that they're going to go in the second round and they're actually going to go in the 5th round, right? Like I would never do that. So like I liked Reed, and he was a guy that didn't come out very strong on our calls with teams. And again, I'm trying to bring the guys the league wants to see, and he didn't get a lot of support on those calls that November. So it's cool to see a guy like Reed kind of stick it to the rest of the league and become a really good player for the Eagles. But I would say like my concern with Reed coming out Loved his instincts, really like the athlete. I love the mover, really fluid mover. I worried about his lack of physicality and kind of pop on contact, like getting people on the ground. He bounced off some tackles and things like that. Would have been my one knock, but I just really like the instincts and the athlete. And so, those guys playing him at free safety and taking him out of some run fits, I think they're playing to his strengths. So again, really cool. Like he and Bryce, man, I love when guys kind of make teams look bad and make me look bad. I don't mind being wrong. So happy for Reed that it's clicking for him up there.
There you go. You know what? Amazingly, the one position we haven't asked you about as we close this out, Jim, is wide receiver. You guys had a bunch of wide receivers of all different skill sets and varieties at the Senior Bowl. The Eagles have two pretty good ones, as you know. Devontae Smith, AJ Brown could really use someone who can play in the slot. And if they're going to go day one or day two, that would be an immediate slot player. Anyone that really jumped out to you there as someone who can do that, make that impact, or just anyone, even a day two or day three guy that you really liked?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot's been made of like Ricky Pearsall and Ladd McConkey and those guys. I mean, they're going to go high. I would say there's a guy that hasn't gotten a lot of love that I think his best football is way ahead of him is Luke McCaffrey from Rice. Went to school in Nebraska as a quarterback, played 2 or 3 years there as a quarterback, went to Rice and started there as a quarterback. We just saw a huge jump from 2022 tape to 2023 tape. I think you can make a strong case he's the toughest receiver in this draft in terms of working into congested areas. I mean, he got his hell. I joked with Luke when he got here. I'm like, man, did they refit you for your helmet? Like, because he had his helmet knocked off like 4 times in the first 6 games for Rice.
Wow.
And he did. He said, yeah, we got that fixed. But which is it's abnormal for a former quarterback. I mean, you wouldn't think a guy would be that tough, but he's got unbelievable ball skills. I think if you did like a highlight reel cut up of if you took the 5 best catches from every receiver in this draft, I think Luke McCaffrey's might be the best of any receiver. Tons of one-handed stuff, going up in traffic, making plays around people. And his route running just really improved. So, again, this year, I think he's going to be a really good slot. I would love to see what he looks like in training camp. Like the jump he made from junior year to senior year was so vast. I'd love to see him by the time we get to August. And once he got around Devontae and AJ and some pro receivers, he's another guy. He left Mobile and blew out the combine, 40-inch vertical jump, 4.4s, unbelievable shuttles and 3-cone. I just think he's getting overlooked right now in a really deep wide receiver class. I think, 3-4 years now, we're going to look back and be like, how the heck did Luke McCaffrey last to the 4th round? There's a name for you.
Interesting case of famous bloodlines and last name, but Rice not always on your local television where if you live in the Northeast or the Midwest or the West, so you don't get a chance to really see him play a whole lot. Luke McCaffrey. All right, we'll close out on this, Jim. I'm really going to put you on the spot here for the last question, but you may be more equipped to answer this than anybody we've ever interviewed. Barring the greatest surprise pick in the history of the NFL draft, Caleb Williams is going to go number 1 overall to the Bears. Who would be, in your mind, the lead candidate to go number 1 overall in the 2025 NFL draft?
Ooh, I'm trying to think of who's up there right now.
I'd be surprised if it's a quarterback, just based on how many this year and what we're looking at, but you never know. Ohio State's got a guy.
And I wish I were in my office right now because I would cheat. I'd just look at the board, but I'm downstairs. No, I'm trying to think right now. I'll tell you positions. I'm not trying to cop out. I'm learning these names right now. The positions of strength right now, running back's going to be a good class next year. Your guy, your Singleton, he's way up there.
Yes, he will not be the number 1 overall pick. I guarantee that.
No, but he's way up there at running back. We actually have 2 Penn State running backs way high up there. I don't know. Like I'll say this, coming off, I'll throw a name out. I was at the Georgia spring game last, a couple Saturdays ago, and their safety Starks was described. Malachi Starks was described to me as the perfect prospect by one of the coaches on their staff.
Wow.
He's long, he's athletic, he's got good size. And they know, right? Like the guys at Georgia know what a good DB looks like. So,
I would think so.
they've got a couple guys this year that are going to go on day 2, and so the Starks kid, his name jumps off. He's way up there right now.
Awesome. Awesome. Really appreciate the time, Jim. It's been great catching up with you. Again, you and your staff do a wonderful job at the Senior Bowl. It gets better every year. I don't know how you did this, by the way, but the day before we got to the Senior Bowl, it was like 38 to 40. I remember looking at the temperature. It was not good. The days we were there, it was upper
Oh,
60s, lower
incredible.
70s. And then the days we left, it went back to being 35. So I don't know how you did it,
That's
but you gave us the greatest stretch of weather that we could ask for.
Well, the Senior Bowl sunburn became a thing this year,
Yes.
True.
which
True.
is awesome. Yeah, well, you always it's hard. It's hard running an event that's so weather dependent. But the nice thing is at the new stadium, we do have that covered indoors, so we can go upstairs if we need to and go up there and have practice. But yeah, it was picturesque, and we wish we could dial that up every year, but it doesn't always happen that way.
All right, great. Well, we look forward to being back in Mobile again next year, and we know you got a lot of work ahead of you. Once this draft is over, it just begins for you and your staff. So really appreciate the time and all the energy and the effort you put in. Jim Nagy, Executive Director of the Senior Bowl. I want to thank everybody for watching. For Jim, for Adam Caplan, I'm Geoff Mosher. You've been watching a special NFL Draft Preview edition of Inside the Birds.